What if everything you've ever decided was already decided for you? Not by fate, not by God, not by chance, but by a law so ancient, so silent, so deeply embedded in the fabric of existence, that most people live and die without ever noticing it. It doesn't appear in textbooks. It wasn't taught in school. And yet, every war in history, every empire that rose and collapsed, every love story that burned and turned to ash, all of it moved according to its logic. The philosophers who touched it went mad or went silent. The mystics who saw it stopped speaking in words. And the few who truly understood it, they didn't fight the world anymore. They moved with it. Tonight, we pull back the curtain. What you're about to hear will not leave you the same. There is a moment somewhere in every human life where everything stops making sense. You follow the rules. You work hard. You do what you were told was right. And still, something collapses. A relationship, a dream, a version of yourself you thought was permanent. And in that silence after the collapse, a question rises. Why does this keep happening? Not just to you, to everyone. The ancient Egyptians asked it standing before the Nile, watching the flood come and go with terrifying precision. The Greek philosophers asked it in marble halls, tracing the movement of stars against the movement of empires. The Vedic sages asked it in the forests of ancient India, sitting perfectly still for years, listening for something beyond thought. They were all circling the same invisible thing. What they found, in different languages, different symbols, different centuries, was surprisingly consistent. Existence is not random. It is rhythmic. It breathes. It contracts and expands. It rises and falls like a tide that answers to no human authority. And somewhere beneath the noise of daily life, beneath politics and ambition and heartbreak, there is a current, a principle, a law operating so quietly that most people never feel it until it turns against them. The Hermetic philosophers of ancient Alexandria called it the principle of rhythm. The Taoist masters of ancient China called it Wu Wei, the flow beneath all force. The Hindu cosmologists called it Kala, not simply time, but the cyclical nature of all existence, devouring and regenerating without mercy, without preference. Even Isaac Newton touched the edge of it, not in his physics, but in his secret writings. Writings he never published, writings he hid, because he understood that what he had found went far beyond science, into something that would unsettle the entire foundation of Western thought. These were not primitive people chasing superstition. These were the sharpest minds in human history. And they all arrived at the same terrifying, liberating conclusion. There is a law beneath the law, a principle deeper than cause and effect, deeper than logic, deeper than the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and why we matter. And it is running right now, in your life, in your choices, in the patterns you keep repeating without understanding why. Here is what makes this law unlike any other hidden truth. It doesn't require your belief to operate. It doesn't need your awareness. It doesn't ask for your permission. It simply is. Like gravity existed before Newton named it. Like electromagnetic fields pulsed through reality before anyone could measure them. The law was always there, shaping civilizations, collapsing ideologies, rotating the wheel of individual human fortune, silently, precisely, without a single announcement. The mystics who discovered it didn't become powerful in the conventional sense. They became something far more unsettling. They became still. In a world of frantic motion, of desperate striving, of endless reaction. They became the quiet eye at the center of the storm. They stopped fighting tides. They stopped mourning when the water receded. Because they understood what very few people in any era have understood, that the tide always returns, and that fighting it is not strength. It is the most sophisticated form of exhaustion. Now here is where it gets dangerous. Because this law, once you truly see it, doesn't only explain history or philosophy or ancient cosmology. It explains you. Your recurring patterns, your cycles of motivation and collapse, your relationships that seem to replay the same emotional script with different people, your strange feeling that life moves in waves, that abundance and drought take turns with suspicious regularity. You have felt this law your entire life. You simply didn't have a name for it. Tonight, you will. And once you have it, you cannot unsee what it reveals. The question is, are you ready to look? Let's begin with something strange. Think about the most significant turning points in your life. The moments where everything shifted, where one era ended and another, sometimes painfully, sometimes beautifully, began. Now ask yourself this. Did those moments arrive in straight lines? Did success build steadily, day after day, like bricks stacking into a wall? Did pain simply decrease in a clean downward slope until it disappeared? Or did it move in waves? Most people, when they sit honestly with this question, feel a quiet shock of recognition, because it moved in waves. Every ancient civilization noticed this about reality before modern thought convinced us that progress was linear, that history moved forward in a straight arrow toward improvement, that human life, properly optimized, could smooth out its oscillations into a flat, manageable line. But the data of lived experience tells a completely different story. The Roman Empire didn't fall in a day. It pulsed. It expanded for centuries, then contracted, then found a second wind, then contracted again, each cycle shorter, each recovery less complete, until the final descent was almost unremarkable. Just one more wave that didn't return. The same pattern appears in every dynasty that ever rose in China's 4,000-year recorded history. Rise, peak, stagnation, collapse, vacuum, rise again. The historians who studied these cycles weren't predicting the future through mysticism. They were reading the law, the same law. Now look closer, look smaller. Because the law doesn't only operate in civilizations and empires. It operates in you. In 1908, a group of esoteric philosophers published a document that would quietly influence some of the most powerful thinkers of the 20th century. It was called the Kybalion. Its authorship was listed simply as the Three Initiates. To this day, no one knows with certainty who they were. But what they articulated in precise, measured, almost mathematical language was a system of universal laws that they claimed governed all of reality. Not just physical reality, mental reality, emotional reality, the reality of consciousness itself. And at the heart of this system was a principle so simple, it almost sounds trivial when you first hear it. Everything flows. Everything has tides. Everything rises and falls. They called it the principle of rhythm. But here is where it becomes genuinely disturbing. They didn't present this as poetry. They didn't present it as metaphor or spiritual comfort. They presented it as mechanics, the same way a clock operates by gears and tension and release. They argued that human consciousness, human fortune, human emotion, human history operates by a rhythm so precise that those who understood it could, in their words, neutralize it, not escape it, not transcend it, neutralize it. The idea was this: if you are aware of the law, you can refuse to be fully carried by the downswing. You can remain mentally elevated even as external conditions descend. You can use the contraction period not as a time of despair, but as a time of preparation for the inevitable expansion that follows. The philosophers used a phrase for this that has stayed hidden in esoteric circles for over a century: the law of compensation. What goes down must come up. But more importantly, what goes up must come down, not as punishment, not as cosmic justice, but as simple, inevitable rhythm. Here is what they found most dangerous about this knowledge. Most people only remember half of it. When things are going well, they forget the law. They believe the expansion is permanent. They overextend. They stop preparing. They mistake a high tide for solid ground. And then the contraction arrives, as it always does. And it feels like catastrophe. It feels like failure. It feels like proof that they are somehow broken, cursed, or unworthy. But they are not broken. They simply forgot the second half of the law. Now think about the last time you felt like a failure. Was it actually failure? Or was it simply the tide going out, exactly as it always does, before it returns? That question will matter more than you realize by the time we reach the end of this. Because the law has a second layer, a deeper chamber, and what lives inside it changes everything. Here is something they don't tell you in any classroom. The most influential figures in human history, the ones who shaped entire civilizations, whose ideas still echo thousands of years after their deaths. Almost none of them understood the world the way their contemporaries did. They saw something different, not because they were supernatural, not because they had access to secret rituals or sacred artifacts, but because somewhere in their lives, often through suffering, often through a complete collapse of their previous worldview, they learned to see patterns where everyone else saw only isolated events. Marcus Aurelius, emperor of Rome and philosopher king, wrote his most profound reflections not during triumph, but during plague and war. Sitting at the edge of a dying empire, he wrote about the rhythm of all things with a calm so unusual it disturbs modern readers. He wrote, "Loss is nothing else but change, and change is nature's delight." He wasn't being poetic, he was being precise. He had felt the law in his own life, felt the contractions, the losses, the reversals of fortune. And instead of fighting them, he had studied them. And what he found was that every contraction, without exception, contained within it the seed of the next expansion, not as guarantee, as structure. This is the first layer of what we might call the hidden law of rhythm. And it operates through a mechanism that modern science has actually begun to confirm, though under very different names. In physics, it appears as oscillation. Every system in nature, every atom, every ocean current, every electromagnetic field exists in a state of perpetual oscillation, not stillness, not linear progress, oscillation, back and forth, expansion and contraction, forever. In biology, it appears in circadian rhythms, the precise internal clocks that govern every living organism on Earth, from the smallest bacterium to the human brain. When these rhythms are disrupted, the organism begins to deteriorate, not slowly, rapidly. The rhythm is not decorative. It is structural. In psychology, it appears in what researchers call ultradian rhythms, the natural 90-minute cycles of high performance and rest that the human brain moves through every single day. Most people spend their lives fighting these rhythms. They push through the rest phases with caffeine and willpower, wonder why their performance collapses, and blame themselves for lack of discipline. They are not undisciplined. They are fighting a biological law they were never taught existed. But here is where the ancient philosophers went further than modern science currently dares to go. They claimed this law didn't only govern the body, it governed the mind. Not just neurological cycles, but the deeper rhythms of human fortune, human consciousness, human reality. The Hermetic text known as the Emerald Tablet, one of the most studied documents in the history of esoteric philosophy, translated by figures including Isaac Newton himself, contains a phrase that has been debated for 2,000 years. As above, so below. As within, so without. Most people have heard this phrase. Very few have understood what it actually means operationally. It means this: the same rhythmic law that governs stars and tides and cellular biology also governs the rise and fall of your personal reality. Your internal state creates a field. That field attracts, repels, accelerates, and collapses external conditions in ways that appear coincidental, but are, according to the Hermetic framework, structurally inevitable. When you are in an expansion phase internally, when your beliefs are aligned with possibility, when your emotional state carries what the ancients called high vibration, external reality responds with what appears to be extraordinary luck. Doors open, coincidences multiply, resources appear. When you are in a contraction phase internally, contracted by fear, by grief, by the belief that the low tide is permanent, external reality responds in kind. The same doors close. The coincidences turn dark. Resources vanish. This is not wishful thinking. This is the law. And here is what makes it both terrifying and liberating simultaneously. The internal state precedes the external condition, not the other way around. The world is not happening to you. The world is, in ways more literal than comfortable, happening from you. This is the point where most people stop listening. Because if this is true, if the law operates this way, then the implications for personal responsibility become almost unbearable. Because it means that every pattern in your life, every recurring situation, every repeating relationship dynamic, every cycle of almost success followed by sudden collapse, has an internal architect. And that architect is not fate. It is the rhythm you are unconsciously broadcasting, and it contains the mechanism of permanent change. There is a concept in Hermetic philosophy called the pendulum, and once you understand it, you will see it everywhere. The pendulum describes the following observation: that consciousness, like all natural systems, swings between poles, high and low, joy and grief, confidence and doubt, expansion and contraction. And crucially, the higher the swing in one direction, the deeper the swing in the other. This is why people who experience extraordinary highs, sudden fame, sudden wealth, sudden romantic obsession, so often report that the crash that follows feels proportionally devastating. They didn't do anything wrong. They didn't fail. The pendulum simply swung back with the same force it was launched forward. Most people spend their entire lives being thrown by this pendulum. They chase the high swings. They fear the low swings. And in doing so, they hand the pendulum complete authority over their emotional reality. The ancient masters noticed something about this that modern psychology is only now beginning to study. The most stable, most effective, most genuinely powerful human beings in history were not the ones who achieved the highest highs. They were the ones who narrowed the swing. The Stoics called this equanimity, not the absence of emotion, the absence of being controlled by emotion. A man who cannot be thrown into ecstasy cannot be thrown into despair, not because he feels nothing, but because he has learned to stand at the center of the pendulum, the still point, and observe the swings without being carried by them. The Taoist tradition described the same principle as Wu Wei, often translated as non-action, but more accurately understood as effortless action aligned with the natural flow. Not passivity, not resignation, but the precise art of moving with the current of the law rather than exhausting yourself against it. A master sailor doesn't fight the wind, but neither does he simply drift. He reads the wind. He understands its rhythms. He adjusts his sails precisely to extract maximum movement from minimum effort. And he arrives at his destination not by brute force, but by intelligence applied to natural law. Now here is the question almost no one asks. If the pendulum swings, and the swing is inevitable, is there anything that can be done? Or is the law simply a beautiful, terrible prison? The answer the Hermetic masters gave is one of the most radical ideas in the history of human thought. They said, yes, there is one thing, not to stop the pendulum, not to escape the law, but to change which level of the law you are subject to. They called it transmutation, and they described it this way. The law of rhythm operates on every level of existence simultaneously: physical, emotional, mental, spiritual. A being who operates primarily at the physical level is completely subject to the physical swings: illness, material fortune, external conditions. These carry him completely. A being who has developed sufficient mental polarization, who has learned to anchor their identity not in physical circumstances, but in a deeper, more stable layer of consciousness, is subject to the swings of that level, which are slower, wider, less violent, and at the deepest level, what the traditions call the level of pure awareness. The rhythm still exists, but the amplitude of the swing approaches something close to stillness. This is what the mystics were describing when they spoke of enlightenment, not the end of experience, but the experience of rhythm from so high a vantage point that the individual waves no longer constitute catastrophe. You see the ocean, not just the wave that is currently drowning you. Now let us bring this out of philosophy and into something immediate. Because you have experienced this mechanism personally, perhaps without realizing what you were doing. Think of a time when external circumstances were genuinely terrible, when by any objective measure, your life was in a state of serious contraction. And yet, somehow, you felt calm, clear, almost inexplicably stable. Something in you had risen above the swing. Not because the circumstances weren't real, they were, but because you had, briefly, found the still point at the center of the pendulum. That experience, that feeling of being the observer rather than the observed, was not an accident, and it was not a personality quirk. It was a glimpse of the mechanism the ancient masters spent lifetimes trying to teach. The law is real. The rhythm is real. The pendulum swings. But you are not only the pendulum, you are also, potentially, the hand that holds it. That is the second layer. But there is a third, and the third layer is where the law stops being philosophical and becomes something that should genuinely disturb you. Because the third layer isn't about what the law does to you. It's about what you do to others with it. Here's the part no one talks about. Everything we have discussed so far has been framed as personal. A law you can understand, work with, even master for your own liberation. A secret tool for navigating the inevitable cycles of human life with greater wisdom and less suffering. But the law is not only a personal mechanism, it is also a weapon, and it has been used as one deliberately, systematically, across centuries of human history. By those who understood it while keeping the rest of the population completely unaware. Consider this. Every mass movement in history, religious, political, revolutionary, follows an almost identical rhythmic structure. A period of extreme suppression, a slow building of tension beneath the surface, a tipping point that appears sudden, but was actually the inevitable crest of a wave that had been building for decades. An explosive release, then a contraction back into a new form of order, often more rigid than the one it replaced. This is not coincidence. This is not the random collision of historical forces. This is the law being used. The most sophisticated manipulators in human history have never been the ones who relied on brute force. Brute force is expensive. It creates resistance. It generates the very opposite swing it tries to prevent. The most sophisticated manipulators understood rhythm. They understood that a population in a state of prolonged contraction, of fear, of scarcity, of manufactured uncertainty, becomes extraordinarily susceptible to the next swing. Because the pendulum, when held artificially in the low position, stores enormous kinetic energy. And whoever controls the moment of release controls where that energy goes. This is the dark application of the law. Create the contraction, hold it, then offer the release in the precise direction you choose. The people don't feel manipulated, they feel liberated, because the liberation is real, the swing is real. They simply weren't told that the contraction was manufactured. Now ask yourself something uncomfortable. How many times in your own life has a contraction arrived precisely when you were beginning to think independently? Beginning to build something autonomous? Beginning to develop a sense of personal power that required no external authority to validate? This may sound like paranoia. It may sound like the kind of pattern seeking that leads reasonable people into conspiracy and delusion. But consider the philosophical framework before dismissing it. If the law is real, and the evidence, across cultures, across centuries, across disciplines from physics to psychology to political history, suggests it is, then it can be studied. And if it can be studied, it can be applied. And if it can be applied by an individual for personal liberation, it can also be applied by an institution, by a system, for collective manipulation. The question is not whether this is happening. The question is whether you can see it. Because here is the devastating insight hidden inside the twist. The law doesn't care who uses it. Gravity pulls the saint and the tyrant with equal indifference. Rhythm oscillates through the freedom fighter and the authoritarian with equal precision. The law has no moral preference. It is pure mechanics, which means the only variable, the only thing that determines whether the law liberates or enslaves you, is awareness. Those who know the law are the riders. Those who don't are the ridden. And here is the most sobering dimension of this. Most people, even when presented with this framework, will not use it for liberation. They will use it unconsciously, habitually, to reinforce the very patterns they claim to want to escape. Because awareness of the law is not enough. Knowledge by itself does not transmute the rhythm. The Hermetic tradition was extremely precise about this point. The Kybalion does not say, understand the principle and you are free. It says, master the principle. And mastery requires something that very few people are willing to do. It requires voluntary contraction. It requires deliberately choosing the low swing, choosing simplicity over stimulation, stillness over noise, depth over distraction. So that when the expansion comes, you are the one choosing its direction, not the one being carried by it. Here is the final and most confronting question this framework raises. If the people who understand this law can use it to navigate their own lives with extraordinary precision, and if the same law can be used by systems of power to keep populations rhythmically compliant, then what separates the master from the managed? One thing. A single insight so simple it almost sounds like nothing. And that insight is waiting in the final revelation. But before we get there, consider that everything you have learned tonight may itself be a kind of pendulum. The more fiercely you believe it, the more fiercely reality may push back. The most dangerous word in this entire conversation is not manipulation, not rhythm, not law. The most dangerous word is striving. Because here is what the entire tradition, Hermetic, Stoic, Taoist, Vedic, arrives at when you follow it all the way to its end. The law controls you precisely to the degree that you are trying to escape it. Every effort to force the high swing, every frantic attempt to prevent the low swing, every strategy, every optimization, every carefully engineered self-improvement routine aimed at finally, permanently, reaching a state of pure expansion. Every single one of these efforts is itself governed by the law. They are pendulum swings. Bigger efforts produce bigger crashes. The cycle accelerates. The exhaustion deepens. And somewhere in the wreckage of the 10th failed attempt to permanently fix yourself, you stop, not in defeat, in recognition. And that moment of recognition, that precise instant where the striving pauses and something older and quieter rises to fill the silence, that is what the ancient masters were pointing at. They called it by many names. The Taoists called it returning to the source. The Stoics called it amor fati, the love of fate. Not resignation, not passivity, but a radical, eyes-open acceptance of the rhythm of your own existence so complete that it transforms the relationship between you and reality entirely. The Hermetic tradition had perhaps the most precise formulation. The wise man does not grieve for what he has lost. He understands that he has simply returned it to the cycle from which it came. This is not comfort. This is not spiritual bypassing. The modern habit of using philosophical concepts to avoid genuine emotional reckoning. This is a precise operational instruction. When you stop relating to the contractions of your life as evidence of failure, and start relating to them as the law simply completing its natural motion, something in your neurology actually changes. Something in your perception actually shifts. You begin to see the geometry of your own life. The patterns that once felt random begin to reveal their structure. The recurring relationships that once felt like personal curses begin to reveal their function. They are pendulum swings you have not yet learned to neutralize. The cycles of abundance and drought that once felt like cosmic cruelty begin to reveal their timing. And when you know the timing, you can prepare. You store resources in the high tide. You rest in the low tide. You plant in the fallow season. You harvest in the expansion. You stop wasting the winter wishing it were summer. But here, right here, is the final revelation. The one that changes the entire meaning of everything that came before it. The law is not the ceiling. It is the floor. Everything we have discussed tonight, the rhythm, the pendulum, the cycles of contraction and expansion, all of it operates at the level of conditioned consciousness. At the level of the self that identifies with its circumstances, its emotions, its story, its history. But the ancient masters, in every tradition, without exception, described a level of awareness that does not oscillate. Not because it has escaped the law, but because it is prior to the law. The Vedantic tradition called it Turiya, the fourth state of consciousness, beyond waking, dreaming, and dreamless sleep. A state of pure witnessing awareness that underlies all experience without being touched by any of it. The Taoist tradition called it the uncarved block. The original nature before conditioning carved it into a shape that the world could push and pull. The Hermetic tradition described it as the all, the infinite mind within which the law operates, but which is itself not subject to the law, because it is the source of the law. And here is what they all agreed on. This level of awareness is not distant. It is not reserved for enlightened masters sitting in Himalayan caves. It is not the reward at the end of a lifetime of spiritual practice. It is available right now, in this moment, in the space between these words. Because it is not something you achieve. It is something you already are. The law controls the person you think you are. It has no jurisdiction over the awareness that knows you are thinking. That awareness, the still, clear, unchanging presence behind every thought, every emotion, every rise and fall. That is what every tradition was ultimately pointing toward when they described the master who had conquered the law. They had not conquered it. They had recognized that they were never fully subject to it. Not because they were special, not because they had discovered a secret technique or accumulated sufficient spiritual merit, but because they had looked directly at the one thing the law requires to operate. A self that believes it is separate from the rhythm. Remove that belief, not by force, but by clear seeing, and the law remains. The rhythm remains. The tides come and go. The pendulum swings. The contractions arrive and the expansions follow. But you are no longer in the wave. You are the ocean that the wave moves through. And from that vantage point, from the quiet, unshakable center of your own awareness, the secret law that has quietly controlled human reality for all of recorded history becomes visible for what it truly is. Not a prison, not a weapon, not even a mystery. Just the breath of existence itself, inhaling and exhaling, forever. And you, if you are willing to stop long enough to notice, are the silence between the breaths. That is the law. That is the secret. Now, what will you do with it? If this changed how you see reality, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want to go deeper into the hidden laws that shape human consciousness, subscribe. Because what we've covered tonight is only the beginning.